Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Brain and Behavior. I am Dr. Ark Verma from ID Kanpur. This is the 6th week of the course and today we will be talking about categorizing emotions. Now, you can begin asking this question or basically begin the task of categorizing emotions by asking a couple of questions. The questions could be, say for example, are emotions psychic entities? Are they things that exist in our abstract mental world that are very specific, biologically fundamental and hardwired with our dedicated brain mechanism? So, basically what I mean by saying is there a thing called happiness? Is there a thing called sadness, anger, despair, love, whatever? Are these actual things that exist in your brain space, in your metaphysical world or in your psychic world, as people like to call it? Okay. So, that is one question. A related question is, if these are things, are they very specific, are they hardwired in the brain, or say for example, are there dedicated brain mechanisms that take care of, let us say, feeling of anger, feeling of happiness, feeling of sadness, feeling of love and so on? Or in a different way we can ask that, are emotions states of mind that are assembled from more basic and general causes? So, the idea could be that the mind undergoes different kinds of subjective experiences, and it could be possible that, say for example, emotions are just assembled from these general causes. Okay. So, general feelings of pleasure or general feelings of disappointment can accumulate to make you feel either very happy sometimes or very angry at others. So, we can sort of ask these questions and we can move ahead to starting to understand how the emotions are categorized. Now, William James, the father of psychology as he is popularly known as, suggested he said this about emotions, where he said that the trouble with emotions in psychology is that they are regarded either too much as absolutely individual things. So, his idea was that he probably had a problem with regarding emotions as separate distinct entities, anger separately, happiness separately, love separately, sadness separately, and he said, so the trouble with emotions in psychology is that they are regarded too much as absolutely individual things. Now, so long as they are set down as so many eternal and sacred physical entities like the old immutable species in natural history, all that can be done with them is reverently to catalogue their separate characters, points and effects. So, as long as we as long as we treat each emotion as a very separate individual entity, then it will be very difficult to sort of sew them together or stitch them together in a particular theoretical framework, or to understand everything, because it will basically all we can do at that point is just to catalogue their separate characters, to catalogue their different points and different effects. But on the other hand, if we regard them as products of more general causes, say for example, as today species are now regarded as products of heredity and variation, or say for example matters of genetic mutation, if we kind of treat them as generic experiential things that are sort of arising out of general experiences, and various permutations and combinations of these experiences are making you feel sometimes happy, sometimes sad, sometimes frustrated, sometimes disappointed, or sometimes proud, sometimes ashamed, guilty and so on. Okay. So, this is basically the idea that James is putting forward. He says, but if we regard them as products of more general causes, the mere distinguishing and cataloguing of them becomes of subsidiary importance. Then we are not really concerned about what each specific emotion is about and what are its characteristic experiences and behaviors. Rather, we can actually put them in a particular framework that will actually further our understanding of emotions. What he says is rather funny, and he says that having the goose which lays the golden eggs, the description of each of the eggs laid is a minor matter. So, he basically the stress is on understanding the whole concept of how our emotions as a general phenomena generated how do they come about, what are the experiences that they lead to, what are the causes that generate them, and so on. So this is one way, or one of the classical let us say oppositions to categorizing emotions. So James, as you can see, says that categorizing emotions is of subsidiary importance, is not really going to help us in furthering our understanding of emotions as a phenomena anyways. James opined that emotions were not basic, nor were they found in dedicated neural structures, but they were typically the melding of a melange of basically different kinds of psychological ingredients honed by evolution. By evolution, as beings, we have learned to experience certain things. We have learned a lot of things culturally, mostly, however, by evolution, let us say. A mix of these different psychological ingredients, mix of these different aspects of experience, you can sort of whip up an emotion and understand it in that sense. Now, as we've kind of already discussed in the last lecture, most researchers agree that the response to an emotional stimuli consists of three parts. What are the three parts? A peripheral psychological physiological response, a behavioral response, and finally the subjective experience or feeling. There is however some disagreement between researchers about the different theories among the different theories of emotion, and basically the idea is what is the chronology of these three, what is the chronology of these three events, what comes first, does a peripheral physiological response come first, does a behavioral response come first, does feeling of that feeling of a particular kind happen earlier. So this is something on which separate different psychologists have different takes and different kinds of disagreements. Now, an emotional stimulus is a stimulus that is very relevant for the well-being and survival of the observer. If the stimulus is not relevant for the well-being and survival of the observer, he will not feel any emotion in response to that stimulus, or she will not feel any emotion in response to that stimulus. So, for instance, some stimuli such as predators may be threats, some others like cute animals may offer betterment opportunities, feelings of love. Say for example, foods may offer opportunities for nourishment, potential partners, etc. So, different kinds of stimuli differ in their potential to elicit different kinds of emotional response. Now, how is the status of a particular emotional stimulus decided on, such as whether a particular stimulus would lead to a quick automated response and stereotyped emotional responses, or if the stimulus if the response is going to be a well thought out one? These kind of questions have puzzled researchers for a long time. People have wondered, say for example, as I was saying I think in the last lecture, if you suddenly come across a snake, do you have the time to think whether I should be afraid or not, whether this snake is poisonous or not, will the snake attack me or it will go its own way? No, you will immediately feel fear. Similarly, but on the other hand, say for example, if you are going to visit a friend for the first time and suddenly you notice that the friend has a pet dog and the gate is still closed, you have that chance, you have that amount of time to wonder on whether this is a ferocious dog, whether the dog will be very friendly, whether I should go inside the house, whether I should call my friend outside, all of those kind of things. So that all of these kind of things have been thought about, and several researchers have kind of spent their time investigating these issues. Now let us look at the different kinds of emotions that we know of. I have been talking about them again and again. So fear, sadness, anxiety, elation, disappointment, anger, shame, disgust, happiness, pleasantness, excitement and infatuation are just some of the emotions that we are aware of. I have still not named all the emotions that are there to experience. However, to better organize our understanding of emotions and quite contrary to what William James would have us do, researchers have focused on three primary categories of emotions. Okay, what are these categories? First is basic emotions. Basic emotions comprise a slightly closed set of emotions, each having unique characteristics as shaped by the evolution. So something that we've sort of learned almost innately through the course of evolution, and they are reflected through our facial expressions. Okay, say for example, fear, happiness, sadness, etc. are basic emotions. Complex emotions are emotions that can be seen as combinations of basic emotions, some of which may be socially or culturally learned, and that can be identified as evolved and long lasting feelings. Some things, let us say this is the second or the third level. Say for example, the emotion of jealousy or the emotion of pride is a mixed bag of a few things. It is a mixed bag of an approach or withdrawal kind of a thing. It is a mixed bag of that you feel you're jealous of only things that you probably like, okay. But then jealousy is a negative emotion, so you'll kind of move away from that kind of thing. So basic emotions are very basic, they are unitary, each having very unique distinct properties, whereas complex emotions are combinations of these basic emotions, some of which may be socially learned or culturally. Say for example, how to react to these different combinations of emotions sometimes can be just learned through our societies. We can say for example learn to have pride in a particular individual who has done let us say so much of national service, social service and so on, and we have learned to be, say for example ashamed of individuals who engage in things, engage in activities that are not good for the well being of others. So some of these things can be learned culturally as well. Now the dimensions of emotions are also very important. Dimensions of emotions are used to describe emotions that are fundamentally the same, but that differ along one or more dimensions. Say for example, the dimensions could be either valence, something is very pleasant or very unpleasant, or arousal, something is again pleasant or unpleasant, same thing, high intense or low intensity in reaction to events essentially. So the dimensions along which the emotions have to be rated are also in that sense rather important to understand this entire thing. Now let us talk a little bit in more detail about each of these categories. Let us talk about basic emotions. Now that some emotions can be regarded as basic or universal derives from the opinion that emotions are innate. That is the basic thing, something that has come through evolution has to be innate. An appropriate stimulus, basically can trigger an evolved brain mechanism in the same way to lead to the same subjective experience all the time. So the idea is that for each of these basic emotions, a particular stimulus will be appropriate. Say for example, a particular stimulus will make you happy, a particular kind of stimulus will make you sad, a particular kind of stimulus will make you angry, and the reaction and the entire cycle will be very predictable. It will be the same all the time when the same kind of stimulus comes. Okay. So it is something very basic, very distinct, but very unique. Okay. Further, under this view, each emotion is assumed to produce predictable changes in sensory, perceptual, motor and physiological functions that can be measured and would thus provide evidence for the fact that this emotion exists. Say for example, if you have to from the back of your hand tell if somebody is happy or not, you can just look at their face. If they are smiling, they are probably happy. Okay. So these basically, so the idea is that each of these basic emotions will lead to predictable responses, sensory, perceptual, motor or physiological responses. If you are very excited, very angry, you will feel, say for example, sometimes people say that I am so angry that my blood pressure is rising. Okay. And every time you become that angry, every time you experience that kind of rage, your blood pressure is going to rise. So predictable physiological reactions, predictable facial expressions, predictable acts as well, predictable experience as well. So this is basically what the basic emotion is supposed to do. Now let us talk a little bit about facial expressions and their relationship to basic emotions. Now facial expressions have been considered, have long been considered as one of the most predictable changes that correspond to changes in what we are feeling on the emotional front. Consequently, it has been assumed that research, if somebody researches or somebody investigates these facial expressions, they will probably get to a window of understanding the basic emotions better as well. Now this is because facial expressions are observable, they are automatic manifestations that correspond to a person's inner feelings. I said if you want to go and check if somebody is happy, look at whether they are smiling or not. If you want to see if somebody is angry, look at whether they are grimacing, whether they are sort of making that clenched face or not. Now, Duchenne de Boulogne was one of the first researchers to investigate facial expressions, and he developed a technique to electrically stimulate a man's facial muscles, and basically what he used to do was he used to methodically trigger muscle contractions, and then he would record them with the results in the newly invented camera. This camera was very new at that time, but what this guy was to do is he would methodically trigger particular muscles, record what the resultant expression is, and then document it along with what the person was feeling. Now, Duchenne published his findings in a book called The Mechanism of Human Facial Expression. Interestingly, Duchenne also had a degree of influence over Charles Darwin, and he inspired basically Darwin's work on the evolutionary basis of human emotional behavior, which Darwin later published in the book The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, where the idea is that both species, men and the other animal species, feel emotions in a sort of a universal manner, in sort of a manner that is common to everyone, okay, common across these species. Now, Darwin proposes that humans have evolved to have a finite set of basic emotional states, and each state is unique in its adaptive significance and physiological expression. So, Darwin basically says that humans have basically this set of very basic emotional states, and each of these sets has its own physiological value, has its own adaptive significance. It helps in the survival, it helps in the propagation of the species in whatever manner. Okay. This put forth the assumption that humans across the board as a species will have the same finite set of universal and basic emotions, contrary to what James was trying to propose earlier. So, this is very interesting, because what Darwin kind of means and says is that emotions exist for particular purposes. They have adaptive survival value, and that is why they are, and because something is involved in the process of the evolution of an entire species, it is going to be available to all the species at once. It's not going to be different for, let us say, Caucasians versus Indians versus Africans. So, the idea is that that's basically what the idea is, that this is a very significant but universal entity. Another notable researcher that investigated the facial expressions was this guy called Paul Ekman. Paul Ekman had specific hypotheses about how emotions are, and he hypothesized that emotions varied along a dimension of pleasant to unpleasant. He said that typically there is this continuum where on one side there are these very pleasant emotions, on the other side there are very unpleasant emotions. He also said that the relationship between a facial expression and what it signified was learned socially. It is something that we come to learn in society through feedback, through hit and trial, and so on. Ekman also said that the meaning of a particular facial expression could vary among cultures. Now, he is somebody who's kind of saying that his idea, his hypothesis was that no, emotions are not universal, they definitely vary across different cultures. Let us see what he found out moving further. So, Ekman kind of set on a path on studying studying emotional processing across different cultures, across from around the world, and then he discovered, contrary to his early hypotheses, that the facial expressions that humans use to convey human emotions do not really vary so much across cultures. Okay. Rather, he actually was forced to conclude that there is a degree of universality in people's experience of emotions. Okay. So, people across these different countries that Ekman traveled felt and expressed and experienced the emotions in a rather uniform manner, in a rather universal manner. Ekman and colleagues suggested that anger, fear, disgust, sadness, happiness and surprise are the 6 basic human emotions which are felt and experienced in the same manner across the various countries, and hence they can be regarded as basic universal emotions. Now, Tracy and Matsumoto in 2008 propose that pride and shame are also true in basic emotions. They did some research. They basically were looking at the non-verbal expressions of pride and shame in reaction to winning or losing in a judo match, winning or losing a judo match at the 2004 Olympic and Paralympic Games in contestants from 37 countries. So these researchers were just focusing on how do people express their emotions of pride or shame corresponding to whether they have won or they have lost. Okay, and in these participants where these guys were doing their research, were sampling from, they were congenitally blind participants as well. Now congenitally blind participants are unique in the sense that they do not have the luxury of learning a particular behavioral response contingent to a particular facial expression culturally, because they cannot see facial expressions. They have no idea of what the significance of facial expressions are. Now all of these contestants which they were testing displayed prototypical expressions of pride upon winning and prototypical expressions of shame upon losing. Now these findings that Tracy and Matsumoto have suggested that behavior associated with pride and shame is also innate, and these two are also basic emotions. It has been agreed upon that all these basic emotions, as I have been saying, are innate, they are universal, and they are short lasting human emotions. Fascinatingly, for some of the basic emotions such as fear and anger have also been confirmed as in animals as well. So it is not only that they are universal emotions for just the human species, for just the Homo sapiens, but they might well extend across species level boundaries as well. But more on that later. Let us talk about complex emotions. Although Ekman's list covers some emotions that are designated as basic emotions, it leaves out several others. Okay? For instance, it leaves out emotions like jealousy and parental love from the list of basic emotions, although some would assume that they are also very basic and are found across species and culture, across the entire species and cultures. Now Ekman called these emotions as emotional complexes, and he has differentiated them from the basic emotions. He said, say for example, parental love, romantic love, envy or jealousy last for much longer period than the duration of these basic emotions, and hence they are not to be put in the same box. Now jealousy has been regarded as one of the more complex emotions. Let us look at it. Now review of clinical literature of patients who have experienced delusional jealousy suggests that it is mediated by more than just the circuit that is we have been talking about as the limbic system. A large network of regions within the brain, including the higher order cortical areas that are involved in social cognition, theory of mind, interpretation of actions performed by others, are involved in people experiencing jealousy. Indeed, with the involvement of so many of these areas, it means that jealousy must be a very complex emotion. In the same vein, romantic love is also regarded as more complex than initially assumed. Ekman differentiates love from basic emotions because no universal facial expressions can actually depict whether somebody is in love or somebody is loved for some other object or event. Now love is a potentially complicated thing, and it can lead the individuals to feel intense feelings and inner thoughts that are not really just expressed by the face, just not expressed by singular facial expressions. Although several acts of love may be professed such as may be professed as that these acts express love, they are not really the emotion itself. They do not really there is no way, there is no direct mapping between the feeling of love, romantic love that is, and a specific facial emotion, facial expression. So there is no mapping here. More recently, researchers have tried to localize the emotion of romantic love in the brain, and what they found is that the subcortical reward networks, the motivation and emotion systems, as well as some of the higher order cortical brain networks that are involved in complex cognitive functions and social cognition, are all involved, and they are all sort of engaged in the experience of romantic love. So indeed, again on the basis of that there is such a bundle of areas that are responsible, love must be a complex goal directed emotion rather than just a very basic one. So, complex emotions such as love and jealousy are regarded as refined, long lasting versions of basic emotions that are more that are culturally specific or individual or vary from individual to individual. So, both the experience of jealousy and love can obviously vary across different individuals. It can vary, the manner and everything else can vary across different cultures as well. So, they are neither universal nor innate in that manner. Let us talk about dimensions of emotions. A different way of categorizing emotions is to understand them as reactions that vary along a continuum of events in the world rather than as discrete states. Now, the dimensions of this continuum may be based upon how arousing or pleasant the emotions are, or how motivated they make a person feel about approaching or withdrawing from an emotional stimulus. Now, let us talk about valence and arousal. Now, researchers generally agree that emotional reactions to stimuli can be characterized by two factors, valence and arousal. Say for example, valence varies between pleasant and unpleasant, and arousal basically varies across high intensity or low intensity of the emotional response. For instance, say for example, we can know that happy is a pleasant feeling, it has positive valence, whereas anger is an unpleasant feeling, it has a negative valence. In a different vein, winning a 10 crore lottery will not only make you happy, but it will make you excited as well. The intensity of the emotion will be too much. However, just finding an old currency note in, say for example, in a book will make you happy probably, but will not really make you super excited. So, the arousal level of that particular event will be slightly on the lower side. Now, by using this two-dimensional approach of tracking both valence and arousal, it has become possible for researchers to concretely assess the kind of emotional reactions that may be elicited by stimuli. Let us look at approach or withdrawal as well. Now, approach or withdrawal is also one of the dimensions that can help categorize how people react with a particular emotion. Now, Davidson and colleagues suggested that the different emotional reactions or states can motivate us to either approach or withdraw from a situation. For instance, the positive emotion of happiness may excite a tendency to approach particular objects or events or engage in the eliciting situation. Suppose, say for example, driving a car makes you feel happy, you would want to drive a car again and again. However, on the other hand, negative valence emotions, say for example, negative emotions like disgust and fear will motivate you to withdraw from the eliciting situation. Say for example, if eating a particular kind of food, watching a particular kind of movie makes you feel disgusted, then you will draw away from watching those movies or eating those kind of foods again and again. So, the approach or withdrawal is basically depending upon whether you want to continue experiencing the eliciting stimuli, or you want to withdraw from experiencing the eliciting stimuli. Alright. So, it is also noted that sometimes certain emotions may have a negative valence, but they still elicit an approach response, like say for example, anger, which is basically a negative emotion, but it elicits a approach response because it sort of sometimes motivates people to do different kinds of things. Also, it is notable that certain motivating stimuli can elicit both approach and withdrawal. Say for example, for a diabetic person who has a sweet tooth, whenever a sweet comes in front of them, they basically want to have it, they like it, but they are also probably conscious of their health and they might want to avoid eating that. So, sometimes there might be stimuli which excite both kinds of approach and withdrawal kind of reactions. Now, finally, merely categorizing emotions as basic, complex and dimensional still does not guarantee that we are able to capture all our emotional experiences. Rather, these may help as a guiding framework for moving further in our quest to understanding them through our scientific investigations. Now, let us talk about a slightly different topic. Let us talk about theories of emotion generation. Now, there are a few theories we will talk about. Let us first talk about the James-Lange theory. Now, William James and Carl Lange postulated this theory. William James postulated that emotions were the perceptual results of the somatovisceral feedback from bodily responses to an emotion provoking stimulus. So, the idea is that when you come across a particular stimulus, there is a somatovisceral reaction, there is a physiological reaction that is basically then followed by an automatic non-conscious interpretation of the physiological response that leads to the experience. So, the idea is to explain the flow of all of this, he takes an example of a man seeing a bear in the forest. Now, upon seeing the bear in the forest, the physiological response of the release of adrenaline shall happen, leading to an increase in the heart rate and the respiratory rates, sweating would happen, and a fight or flight response will take place, and then this will be followed by the interpretation of why am I feeling like this and the subjective feeling of being afraid. So, in James's view, one does not automatically start running on seeing a bear because one is afraid, but rather one is afraid because one interprets the physiological response to the stimulus as one of fear. Okay. So, James and Lange believed that with emotion there is a specific, with each emotion there is a specific physiological reaction, and that people could not feel an emotion without first having bodily reaction. So, for example, you cannot feel happiness, anger, sadness, disgust without having the characteristic physiological the characteristic butterflies in the stomach, if I may use the metaphor, and you cannot have that feeling before the physiological response takes place in your body. Let us move to the next theory, the Cannon-Bard theory. Now, Walter Cannon and Philip Bard proposed that the physiological responses to emotion are not distinct enough to distinguish between different emotions such as fear, anger, sexual attraction, etc. They said in addition that the neuronal and hormonal feedback processes are too slow to precede and account for the experience of emotions. They are basically saying that it is very difficult that the physiological responses come before the experience of emotion. It is highly unlikely is what they said. Now, Cannon thought that the sympathetic nervous system coordinated the reaction while the cortex simultaneously generated the emotional feeling or the feeling of the emotion. So, Cannon found that when he had severed the cortex from the brainstem above the hypothalamus and the thalamus, cats still had an emotional reaction when provoked. More importantly, they observed that the emotional reaction could actually occur without understanding or without connection with cognition, because obviously the cortex had been severed. So, Cannon and Bard proposed that an emotional stimulus was processed by the thalamus and sent simultaneously to the neocortex and then to the hypothalamus from there, which would produce that peripheral physiological response. So, the neocortex is supposed to generate the emotional feeling, while the periphery actually is carrying out the slower emotional reactions. So, let us go back to the bear example. What is going to happen when one would see a bear? The information will pass through the hypothalamus to the neocortex, where the interpretation will take place, and that will make one feel afraid, while at the same time the hypothalamus will regulate the sympathetic nervous system to lead to a physiological response. So, the idea is that the physiological response and that feeling of fear are happening at the same time in response to this particular stimulus. Okay. Now, let us move to the other theory, the appraisal theory. Now, the appraisal theory is in fact a bunch of theories in which emotional processing is deemed to depend upon an interaction between the stimulus properties and their interpretation. Remember the earlier example that I was giving you, the same stimulus might make you more happy, less happy, or sometimes the same stimulus might make you either happy or sad depending upon your calculations of the risk and benefit scenario. These theories, the appraisal theories that is, differ about what is appraised and what are the criteria for appraisal. An appraisal basically is a subjective step that may be used to explain people's reactions. So, the idea is first cognition, first appraisal will happen, and then only the physiological response or the subjective experience of feeling will come about. Lazarus, who has given this theory of appraisal, basically proposed this theory where emotions are seen as a response to the reckoning of the ratio of harm versus benefit in a person's encounter with something. Okay. So, when you come across a particular stimulus, you are very quickly calculating whether it is good for me, bad for me, whether I should feel happy, whether I should feel sad, and on the basis of that one decides that what will be the physiological responses, what will be the subjective feeling be like. Okay. So, more specifically, just to kind of get in a little bit deeper, more specifically individuals consider personal and environmental variables when evaluating the significance of a particular stimulus for well-being. So, the cause of the emotion is both the stimulus and its significance. Suppose you hear a news, let us take an example, suppose you hear news that you have been offered a job in a city which is in. Now obviously the prospect of getting a job will make you happy, but you will very quickly calculate that, okay, what is the salary that they are offering me? Is the salary going to be enough for me to be living there? Is the job profile expectation of the job going to be exciting enough for me to be interested in the job for a long time? And at the same time, while the news is a happy news and you have been selected for a specific job, you will do this risk benefit analysis, and on the basis of that you will basically feel either very happy or very sad or somewhere in the middle. So the cognitive appraisal has to come before the emotional response or the subjective feeling, whereas appraisal must be considered almost as an automatic reaction. As soon as a stimuli comes, you automatically appraise it, and that is what would lead to either you feeling happy or sad, or your physiological responses be like the racing of the heart rate or dulling of the heart rate. So coming back to the example of seeing a bear. One would first automatically make an appraisal of the risk benefit scenario. Say for example, whether it is going to maul me. Say for example, if you are seeing a bear not in the forest but in a cage, you obviously know that the bear is not going to be able to harm you, so you are not going to freak out or become too afraid. But obviously if you are seeing the bear in the open forest, obviously you will automatically figure out that the bear is going to attack you, and it will eventually lead you to a physiological response of fight or flight and a subjective experience of feeling afraid, terrified, and so on. Okay, let us move to the next theory, the Schachter-Singer theory of basically the cognitive interpretation of arousal. Now the Schachter-Singer theory basically proposes that emotion generation is based upon our attribution of the source of our physiological responses. Why are these physiological responses there? How can I understand them? Okay. So they propose that that emotional arousal and reasoning is actually required to appraise a stimulus before the emotion can even be identified. So leave alone experiencing a particular emotion, some kind of reasoning is going to be there to understand what a stimulus is triggering, and then only something else will come up. As per the bear example, when one sees a bear, the physiological reaction will precede the appraisal and the attribution of the physiological arousal, which will eventually make you feel either make you feel scared actually in this case. Let us talk about constructivist theories. Now constructivist theories are a bunch of theories that propose that emotions arise from cognition, they arise from reasoned analysis, and that the reasoned analysis is actually the one that is shaped by our culture and our language. Okay. So as per the conceptual act model given by Lisa Barrett, emotions are considered as man-made concepts that emerge when we are trying to make meaning of the sensory inputs from the body and the world. So whatever stimuli in the world or events in the world we are coming across, we are going to try and understand that, and we are going to try and understand them through specific frameworks, and these frameworks are given to us by our culture and by our language. So let us take an example. First what we will do is we will form a mental representation of the bodily changes that are referred to as the core effect, whether going to have a pizza makes me happy. What is the core effect of going to eat a pizza is that probably I am feeling happier. This is then classified according to the language based emotional categories. Now I could use happiness, or I could use excitement, or I could use any different word based on how my culture has taught me to categorize this specific bodily change that I was experiencing on going to eat a pizza. Okay. So this is where you have to understand that the idea is that things are happening in the world, there are events taking place in the world, there are objects that you are going to come across, and each of these objects will make you feel a particular way. How you understand what you are feeling, how you categorize that using language is something that you have most naturally picked up from your culture, because language, as I have said several times, is almost an instrument of a particular culture. So the way stuff is encoded in languages, in specific languages, depends upon the specific cultures that use those languages. We will discuss that probably in the next chapter or later, but the idea is that these categories that we make to understand the core effect or the cause of the core effect varies according to the culture and the language of different people, and therefore because there is so much more variation here, there can be no empirical criteria for judging an emotion. Okay. So that is also something that is fairly important. Now again, going to the example of seeing a bear, what will happen? One would first have a physiological response, after which the brain calculates all the previous encounters with the bear. What happened the last time I came across a bear? Did it attack me? Did it not attack me? What really happened? And then basically we compare those previous encounters with the current encounter, and we try and basically figure out what is it that we should feel, what is it that this specific or unique experience is to be named, and then we can name it as fear. Let us talk about the evolutionary psychology approach. Now, Leda Cosmides and John Tobey propose that emotions are conductors of an orchestra of cognitive programs that actually need to be coordinated to produce good successful behavior, and the goal and in all evolutionary theories is that emotions will somehow need to benefit our survival. It will need to somehow further our chances of adapting and surviving to this in this changing world. So, Leda Cosmides and John Tobey suggest that emotions are an overarching program that directs the cognitive sub-programs and their interactions. So, the idea is emotions are broad programs that are going to govern or influence our well-being in particular manner. So, more specifically, an emotion is not considered to be as reducible into any one category of effects, such as things like physiological responses, behavioral inclinations, or cognitive appraisals. Rather, in coordinated, they are supposed to be as involved coordinated instructions for all of these at the same time. Okay. So, an emotion not only is supposed to instruct other mechanisms throughout the human and mental and physical architecture. So, the idea is once you are going to experience something that is going to sort of control several things about how your body is going to be. So, going back to the bear example, when one sees a bear, one detects a possible ambush scenario and automatically activates a hardwired program, one that you have evolved to have, and basically that program will say you have to run, you have to save yourself, you have to guarantee that your well-being is there, and so only after that perception and attention etc. will get affected. So, perception and attention will get oriented automatically, and motivations will change. The motivation will be that you want to save yourself. The information gathering mechanisms will start to look for where can I run to, which direction, where is there a possible shelter. Memory will come in place and will tell you, okay, if you run for 3 minutes on the left, there is a big tree, you can hide behind the tree, or say for example there is a house, you can get inside the house, and so on. So, the idea is that overall emotions are overarching evolutionary mechanisms which have the capability of instructing how the brain is going to behave, how the body is going to behave, and so on. So, I think these were some of the theories of emotion that we had to talk about. We will talk a little bit about one of these theories that is not really a theory of emotions per se in general, but a theory basically which says that the humans may have like two emotion systems that operate in parallel. So, it kind of specifies how humans how the human emotional processing system might be structured. So, Ledoux basically proposed this theory of a high road and a low road, and he said there are two systems. One of the systems is a neural system for our emotional responses, and the other is a system for the generation of a conscious feeling of emotion. So, one is a slightly slower feeling of how you are going to feel about it, and the other is how your body or how your brain is going to respond to it. Okay. So, the emotional response system is supposed to be hardwired, one of these systems is supposed to be hardwired by evolution to produce fast responses that would basically increase our chances of survival, whereas the conscious feelings, the second system, are separate from these and they are not hardwired, but learned through experience given in a particular culture or language. So, on seeing a bear, the hardware response of fight or flight will set in on one hand, whereas the feeling of feeling that one is afraid will sort of set in more slowly. The first reaction is just run. Leave the bear example, come to the snake example. Is as soon as you step on a snake, you will immediately want to run and not really ponder about what you are feeling at that point in time. Now, Ledoux actually was one of the first researchers that sort of talked about the role of amygdala in emotional processing, and amygdala are these small almond shaped structures in the medial temporal lobe just adjacent to the hippocampus. So, amygdala are these intriguing and complex structure which is basically a collection of 13 different kinds of nuclei. The amygdala can be divided into 3 kinds of amygdaloid complexes. The largest area is the basolateral nuclear complex, which consists of lateral basal and accessory basal nuclei. The basal nucleus is the gatekeeper of the amygdala input. So, all the input that comes through comes to the amygdala is received as this basal nucleus, and basically it also receives the input from all the sensory systems. This multifaceted basal nucleus is important for mediating instrumental behavior such as running away from bears. So, amygdala is in that sense is a very important region. Now, the centromedial complex is basically consists of the central nucleus and the medial nucleus. So, 2 of these nucleus are here, and the medial nucleus is basically the output region for innate emotional responses, including behavioral, autonomic and endocrine responses. So, how is the body going to respond to a particular kind of a emotion provoking stimulus? The smallest complex is basically the cortical nuclei, which is or the cortical nucleus, which is also known as the olfactory complex of the amygdala, because it receives its inputs primarily from the olfactory bulb and the olfactory cortex. So, these are the 3 basic amygdaloid complexes which basically are divided from the 13 nuclei that the amygdala is made up of, and amygdala is regarded as one of the important structures for experience of emotions. Let us look at this in a bit more detail. Now, the importance of the medial temporal lobe structures as important for emotional processing came around early in the 20th century, where Heinrich Kluwer and Paul Bucy documented what later came to be known as the Kluwer and Bucy syndrome. Now, the Kluwer-Bucy syndrome refers to the lack of fear responses to stimuli that would normally elicit a fear response. So, typically this was first observed in monkeys, that when their amygdala was lesioned, they would not display a fear response, they would not be afraid of stimuli to which generally most other monkeys would be afraid of. They will withdraw from that, they will show a certain degree of physiological arousal. So, the observed deficit of this kind was referred to as psychic blindness earlier, because it was characterized also as the inability to recognize the emotional importance of objects and events. So, you are not able to evaluate whether a particular stimulus, object or event is significant emotionally, does it have any emotional value to me. Okay. It was in the 1950s when the amygdala was identified as the primary structure underlying these deficits in fear responses. So, later people came to know that okay, this is happening because the amygdala is damaged. Okay. When researchers lesioned the amygdala of the monkeys selectively, the monkeys displayed a normal disproportionate impairment in cautiousness and distrust. They would approach novel stimuli, they would approach even frightening objects as snakes or even potential predators. You keep a lion in front of the monkey, the monkey will fearlessly go and approach the lion, not because the monkey basically because the monkey is not able to experience any feeling of fear, etc. Okay. A similar response in humans was also observed in a patient called SM, who had a peculiar disorder known as the Urbach-Wiethe disease. The disease is interesting in the sense that it leads to atrophies of the bilateral amygdala, both left and right, but in a slightly selective fashion. The surrounding tissue is spared. Now, SM would also exhibit a lack of consciousness and distrust, and she would not demonstrate fear even when facing stimuli that would make everyone else afraid, watching horror movies, looking down from cliffs, touching dangerous and poisonous snakes as well. So, researchers realized that the amygdala must be important for general emotional processing as well, because of its vast connections to so many other brain regions. So, amygdala is implicated in fear. We saw that in the Kluwer-Bucy syndrome or the Urbach-Wiethe disease just moments ago, but because the amygdala is connected with so many of the other areas in the cortex, researchers sort of thought that okay, it must be responsible or it must be important for general emotional processing as well. Okay. So, indeed the amygdala is obviously the most connected structure of the forebrain. Its extensive connections have critical roles in learning, memory and attention, and is responsible, and it sort of it does respond to emotionally significant stimuli. The amygdala contains receptors for the neurotransmitters glutamate, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin and acetylcholine. It also contains hormone receptors for glucocorticoids and estrogen, and peptide receptors for opioids, oxytocin, vasopressin, corticotropin releasing factor and the neuropeptide Y. So, I am just naming here certain neurotransmitters. You can at a later point Google up their functions. I have talked about their functions in a different lecture, but the idea is that the amygdala, because of these connections, because of having these so many receptors, is in a position that it can modulate the way people experience different emotions. Several proposals have been offered to explain the role of the amygdala in emotional processing. Luis Pessoa has suggested that the amygdala may be involved in determining what a stimulus is and what is to be done about it. So, basically evaluating the emotional significance of a stimuli. And thus it is supposed to be the amygdala is supposed to be involved in perception, attention, value representations and decision making. So, that is basically what the function of the amygdala is supposed to be. In a similar vein, Lindquist and colleagues have also suggested that the amygdala is actually an active region of the brain when the rest of the brain cannot really easily predict what the initial sensations mean. Amygdala sort of processes that and directs the actions. So, it basically tells the other regions what to do about these initial sensations and what value does a particular event or object hold in a given context. So, for example, if you are coming across again the snake, the amygdala is the area of the brain which will act immediately and quickly and will tell the autonomic nervous system to act in a particular manner, while the rest of the cortex will basically play catch up in a much more gradual manner. Okay. So, the amygdala therefore seems to have the ability, the amygdala seems to have the ability to signal other parts of the brain to keep working until some of these initial issues have been figured out, the initial action plan has been drafted. However, Lindquist's proposal of how she imagined the role of the amygdala has been questioned by researchers who studied the patient SM who had amygdala atrophy. Because the patient did not really display deficit in any other emotion other than fear. So, the idea is that probably amygdala is selectively responsible for understanding and expression of fear. Further, SM also understands the saliency of emotional stimuli, although she has a very specific impairment in the induction and experience of fear across a wide range of situations. So, she understands the emotional significance of stimuli, just that she does not understand the the emotional significance of fear inducing stimuli. Okay. So, the suggestions are therefore in line that amygdala must be a critical region for triggering a state of fear in response to encounters with threatening stimuli in the environment. And the idea is that the amygdala must have these connections between the sensory and the association cortex that are required to represent the external stimuli, as well as the connections between the brainstem and the hypothalamic circuitry that is necessary for orchestrating the action program for fear, what is going to be done. So, this is basically probably what the role of the amygdala is. I will stop here. I will talk to you about emotions again in the next